smell of pine and lake water used to mean everything to me. 40 years ago, I bought a small cabin on the shores of Lake Muskoka with the money I'd saved from 12-hour shifts at the mill. My late wife, Carol, cried when she first saw it. Happy tears, she told me, because she never imagined we'd own something so beautiful. We raised 3 kids in that cabin every summer. We taught them to canoe, to gut fish, to sit still long enough to watch a loon dive and resurface 30 meters away. I thought those summers had taught them something important about life. I was wrong about 2 of them. I'm 67 years old. For 31 years, I ran a mid-sized construction company out of Barrie, Ontario. Nothing flashy. Residential and light commercial, driveways, additions, small condos. I built it from a one-truck operation into a business with 40 employees at its peak. I was never the kind of man who talked about money at the dinner table, but I was careful with it. By the time I sold the company 5 years ago, I had done well, very well. My oldest, my son, is a partner at a Bay Street law firm in Toronto. Mergers and acquisitions. He earns more in a month than I made in my first 5 years in business. My daughter, the middle one, is a radiologist at a private clinic in Vancouver. She and her husband own 2 properties and take 4 vacations a year. I know this because she posts every single one on Instagram. I've seen the photos, even though she stopped calling as often once the grandchildren were old enough to have their own schedules. And then there's my youngest, my daughter Penny. She works as an early childhood educator at a daycare in Sudbury. She drives a 2014 Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper that's been there since 2019. She rents a 2-bedroom apartment with a friend because, on her salary, that's what makes sense. She doesn't take vacations to Portugal or Tulum. She visits me every couple of months, brings a casserole, and sits at my kitchen table long enough to actually ask how I'm sleeping. Carol passed away 6 years ago. Breast cancer. Caught late. The grief took something from me that I don't think I ever fully recovered. But after 2 years of rattling around the house in Barrie alone, I started to find a kind of quiet rhythm. I cooked for myself, kept the garden going, had coffee every morning with my neighbor Hank, who is 72 and has opinions about everything. It wasn't the life Carol and I had imagined for our later years, but it was mine. What slowly crept up on me, and I say slowly because I kept finding excuses, kept explaining it away, was how little my 2 older children seemed to need me unless they needed something from me. My son called on my birthday and at Christmas. In between, there was silence, unless he was looking for advice on a real estate decision or asking whether I'd be willing to co-sign something with my name for a family member's mortgage application. The last time he visited Barrie was 18 months before any of this started. He came for a Sunday, arrived at noon, left by 4, and spent most of that time on his phone on the back deck. My daughter in Vancouver was warmer on the surface, more texts, the occasional video call, but there was always a quality to our conversations that felt like she was managing me. Checking in the way you check on something you want to make sure isn't going to become a problem. When Carol was sick, she flew home twice. When Carol died, she stayed for the funeral and left the next morning because of a shift she couldn't miss. I understood that. I told her I understood that. But some things you understand and still feel. The idea came to me slowly, the way most important decisions come when you're past 60. It wasn't a plan so much as a question I kept asking myself while staring at the water from my dock. If everything disappeared tomorrow, who would show up? I talked to my old friend Hank about it one evening in September. He's the kind of man who listens without interrupting, which is rarer than people think. You already know the answer, he said when I finished. I think I do, I said, when I finished. I think I do, I said, but I need to be sure. He was quiet for a moment. If you're going to do something like that, do it properly. Don't half-measure it. I called my lawyer the following week. Gordon had handled my business sale and knew my finances in detail. I sat across from him and told him exactly what I was thinking. He leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. You want to simulate financial collapse, he said. And a health scare, I said, something that makes it real. He was quiet for another moment. Then, I'm not going to talk you out of it. but I am going to make sure you do it in a way that doesn't actually hurt you, legally or financially. And you're going to need to be honest with Penny afterward. Every detail." "I know," I said. "She'll be the only one who goes through this genuinely," he said. "I know that too. We spent 3 weeks building the story carefully. Gordon drafted documentation, a series of bad investments that would appear to have gutted my retirement savings, a failed private equity position, a real estate development in northern Ontario that went sideways. These were all fictitious, but detailed enough to be plausible to anyone who didn't have access to my actual accounts. Gordon would serve as the gatekeeper for the truth the entire time. The health element was my addition. I'd had a minor cardiac event 2 years earlier. Nothing serious, a warning, the cardiologist called it, and I'd taken it seriously enough to change my diet and start walking every morning. But my children knew about it. They knew there was history there. So when I drafted the message I would send them, I included a detail about chest pains and a recent episode that had frightened me. Not a stroke. Something vaguer, something that sounded like a man who was both sick and scared and broke. I sent the same message to all 3 of them on a Tuesday morning in late October. To my son, I wrote, "I need to talk to you about something serious. I've been having some health issues, and I've also discovered some significant problems with my finances. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Can you call me?" He called that afternoon. I told him the version we prepared. The investments, the losses, that I was looking at having to sell the Barry house, that I'd had 2 episodes of chest pain in the past month and was waiting on test results, that I didn't have anyone to help me sort through this. There was a pause on the line. "How much are we talking about, Dad?" That was his first question. Not, "Are you okay? Do you want me to come? Do you need someone there?" "How much?" I told him a number that represented most of what he believed I had. Another pause. "Dad, I've got a huge file closing at the end of November. I'm essentially living at the office right now. But listen, have you thought about talking to a financial advisor? Like someone who specializes in restructuring in situations like this? I can ask around, get you a name." I said I didn't need a name. I said I needed someone to help me figure out whether to sell the house or try to hold on. "That's really a question for a real estate lawyer, not me," he said. "I don't do property law. I could give you a referral." I thanked him. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. My daughter in Vancouver called the next day. She was gentler in her tone. I'll give her that. She asked about the chest pains first, which meant something, but within 10 minutes, the conversation had shifted. "Dad, I have to be honest with you. We've been talking about some big expenses of our own. Evan's parents might be coming to live with us. We've been looking at building a suite on the property, and we've just taken on a renovation that's been more than we budgeted." I said I understood. "I don't think we're in a position to help financially right now. I'm sorry, Dad. I really am." I told her I wasn't asking for money. I told her I just needed some guidance, maybe some company, maybe just someone to come and sit with me while I figured things out. "I could maybe fly out in January," she said. "Things should be a bit calmer then." January. It was October. "That would be nice," I said. I drove to Sudbury the next day. I hadn't told Penny anything yet. I showed up at her apartment unannounced, which I almost never do, and when she opened the door and saw my face, she immediately stepped back and said, "Dad, what happened? Come in." I sat down at her kitchen table, smaller than mine, secondhand with mismatched chairs, and I told her the story. All of it. The investments, the losses, the chest pains, the house potentially having to be sold. I watched her face as I spoke. There was no calculation in it, no pause where I could see her doing math. She just listened, and when I was finished, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "Okay," she said. "Here's what we're going to do." She'd found a temporary solution by that evening. She had a pull-out couch in the second bedroom. Her roommate had moved out 2 months earlier, and she hadn't found anyone new yet. She told me I could stay as long as I needed. She called her workplace the next morning and arranged to take a week off, which I later found out cost her vacation time she'd been saving for a trip home at Christmas. She took me to a walk-in clinic about the chest pains because she said she wanted the doctor to actually hear about them, fake or not. Because, Dad, you're 67 and I'd rather overreact. She sat in the waiting room for 2 hours without complaint, reading a paperback she'd pulled from her bag. She made soup, real soup, from scratch, not from a can, because she'd remembered that Carol used to make soup whenever anyone in the family was unwell, and she thought it might help. It did. I don't know how, but it did. One evening, about a week in, I was sitting in her living room watching the news when she came in from the kitchen and sat across from me. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something." I waited. I talked to Mike at the credit union. I have about $8,000 in my TFSA. It's my emergency fund. I want to use some of it to help cover your immediate costs, utilities on the Barry house, whatever's coming due, until we figure out a longer-term plan. I looked at her for a moment. $8,000. Her entire emergency fund. "Penny," I said. "I know you do it for me," she said simply. That was the moment I came closest to telling her the truth right then. I didn't. I needed to see it through. But I didn't sleep much that night. She also, without telling me, reached out to a legal aid resource she'd read about for seniors in financial distress because she wanted to make sure I understood all my options before making any decisions about the house. She sent me the information in a text with a note that said, "You don't have to figure this out alone." I had been living in her apartment for 2.5 weeks when I asked her if she could come with me to meet with Gordon. I told her he had some information about my situation and that I'd like her there. She drove us in the dented Civic 3 hours south on the 400 and asked me twice on the drive whether I was sure I was feeling okay. Gordon's office is on a quiet street in downtown Barrie, nothing grand about it. Brick building, second floor, a waiting room with worn chairs and a plant that looked like it had seen better years. He came out and shook both our hands and brought us into the room where I'd sat with him 6 weeks earlier. He set a folder on the desk between us and looked at Penny. "Your father asked me to share some information with you today," he said. "But before I do that, I need you to know that everything he told you over the past few weeks about the losses, the investments, none of it was real." Penny went very still. She looked at me. I said, "I need you to let me explain." She said nothing. She just looked at me with those eyes that looked so much like her mother's, and I felt for a moment like the worst person on earth. I told her everything, why I'd done it, what I'd needed to know, what I'd found out not just about her, but about her brother and sister. I didn't try to dress it up or make it sound noble. I told her I'd been frightened, truly frightened, about what would become of me if something real ever happened, and I needed to know the truth while I could still do something about it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You scared me, Dad. You really scared me." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." Another silence. "Then, was any of it real? The chest pains?" "No." She exhaled slowly. "Okay." She looked at the folder on the desk. "So what's actually in that folder?" Gordon opened it and walked her through the reality of my finances. The full picture. The number at the bottom of the page. She stared at it for a moment. "Dad." "Yes. You have—" She stopped. Started again. "This is real. That's real." She looked at the window, then back at me. There were tears in her eyes, but she wasn't crying, not quite. "I don't know whether to hug you or be furious with you." "Both seems reasonable," I said. She did hug me eventually. In the parking lot, after we'd spent another hour with Gordon going through everything, she hugged me and held on for a long time, and I felt, somewhere in my chest, something loosen that had been tight for years. I contacted my son and my daughter in Vancouver the following week. I asked them both to come to Barrie. Told them I had something important to share. That it was about my plans for the future. My son came, though he rescheduled once. My daughter in Vancouver flew in on a Friday. We sat in my living room, the four of us, and I told them what I'd done. My son's face shifted through several expressions very quickly. Surprise, then something that looked like embarrassment, then a kind of careful composure that I recognized as his professional manner. "Dad," he said, "I understand why you might have felt the need to. I don't want a debrief," I said. "I just want you to understand what happened. My daughter in Vancouver cried. I believe her tears were genuine. She said she hadn't realized. She said she'd been so caught up in her own life. She said she was sorry. I believed her too. Or at least, I believe she believed it in that moment. I told them both that I loved them. I told them I had already met with Gordon and revised my estate plans. I didn't give them the numbers that day because that wasn't the point. The point was everything else. Gordon met with all of them the following month. By then, I'd had several separate conversations with each of my children, real ones, longer than we'd had in years. With my son, I sat on the phone for 2 hours one night, and we talked about things we hadn't talked about since Carol died. He admitted he'd let distance become a habit and that he wasn't proud of it. It wasn't a full repair, but it was a beginning. My daughter in Vancouver called more in those weeks than she had in the preceding 2 years combined. Some of it, I suspected, was awareness of the estate. I'm not naive about that. But some of it was real, too. I chose to meet her where she was. With Penny, things were different. We didn't need to rebuild anything because nothing had been broken. What we did instead was spend time, real time, the kind that doesn't have an agenda. I drove up to Sudbury 3 weekends in a row, and we went to the farmer's market, and I fixed the leaky tap in her bathroom, and we watched 2 seasons of a show she liked that I never would have found on my own. When Gordon finalized everything, the estate was divided like this. My son and my daughter in Vancouver each received a sum that was meaningful, enough to matter, not enough to have been owed. It wasn't nothing, but it came with conditions, a charitable giving requirement tied to community organizations in the regions where they lived, structured over 5 years. Gordon had suggested this. I thought it was right. Penny received the cabin on Muskoka. She received the Barry house, which she decided to rent out rather than sell, because she said she wasn't ready for it not to exist yet. And she received a trust that would allow her to stop worrying about the dented Civic and the TFSA she'd been about to empty for a father who, it turned out, had not needed it at all. She cried when Gordon told her, not the restrained tears of the parking lot, but real crying, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, and she kept saying she didn't understand why. And I kept saying because I know who you are, which seemed insufficient, but was the most honest thing I could offer. There was a line from something I read once, I don't remember where, about how you don't really know what you have until you watch it be tested. I've thought about that a lot in the months since. I think it's partly true, but I've also come to think that testing is never quite as clean as we want it to be. It leaves marks. Penny forgave me entirely, I think, because she is who she is. But I also don't think she's forgotten those 2.5 weeks of genuine fear. I'm not sure she should. I'm spending this summer at the Muskoka cabin. Penny came up for the long weekend in July. She brought a friend, a woman she'd worked with for years who turned out to be very funny and who paddled a canoe significantly better than I do at this age. We had a fire both nights and talked until late, and I fell asleep both evenings listening to the water against the dock. It's the same sound it's always been, but it means something different now. Not because anything about the lake has changed, but because I know, with a certainty I didn't have before, exactly who would show up if the silence ever became something more than quiet. And that, I've decided, is worth more than everything else I could have left behind.